Hi, I'm Dr. Rogers Noguera from Bahrain Teachers College, University of Bahrain, and welcome to our course Psychology of Learning in Teachers Classroom. Our topic for today is the Module 2, which is the nature of the mind, a biological perspective of learning. What makes learning exciting is when the teacher understands how the mind works inside the classroom. And this is exactly what the module 2 is going to explain. The biological perspective of learning is fundamentally pointing into the aspect of the brain, the sensory and memory. But the thing is that many of the teachers do not really have enough understanding on how the brain, sensory, and memory works. Most of the teachers are so focused on the curriculum, on the content of learning, on the content of on the subject, let's say the math, the science, the language. But very often we forget how the brain sensory and the brain sensory and memory responds to the learning processes happening in the classroom. So today, we will try to explain in a very simple way how this brain and sensory and memory works inside the classroom, and what as teachers, what can we do, because this is a very complicated, this subject is very complicated. So how can we make this very simple in such a way that when we, after this module, we'll be able to really use it, maximize our understanding of the brain, sensory, and memory. Okay. So how does learning happen in the biological perspective? It is like this, whether we like it or not. When we talk about the biological perspective of learning, learning will definitely happen. Thinking will happen. Why? Because by nature, that's why we call it biological. By nature, we have the brain, we have the sensory and memory. Whether there is a teacher in front of us or not, we are going to learn, we're going to think, because the nature gave us an element in our life that will make us think, and that is the brain, the sensory, and memory. Again, let's go back to the nature of the brain, sensory, and memory. So I've mentioned earlier, the brain, sensory, and memory are very much connected, are very much interrelated. We can talk about it separately, but when you start to reflect and we start to think about how they work, they are not separated. They work together. The brain, the sensory, and memory. And you will have to pay attention to the fact that our life as a human being, our functioning as a human being, our the way we work, the way we think, the way we act, the way we behave, anything that we plan in our mind is happening because of the brain, sensory, and memory. To illustrate to you better, for example, with this one, uh, this is my friend Brainy. Okay, so you have here the brain, you have the sensory. By the way, when you talk about sensory, what comes to your mind when you talk about senses? The sensory senses. When we talk about senses, very often we only talk about the five basic senses: the seeing, the what do you call this, the hearing, the touch, so on and so forth. But you have to remember that senses is not only from the outside, it's also from the inside. Your whole body, your whole body, actually, your whole body is about your sensory. Okay, and when you talk about memory is not only about the brain. memory, we store the memory not only here, we also store our memory in our body. For example, how can you have a memory of seeing if the sensory does not work for you? So if you remove the senses, the brain will not be able to have a memory of seeing, or even the memory of taste, the memory of touch. So they work side by side. For example, here, just to illustrate to you how our memory works, that memory is not only happening here. Your body is a depository. We deposit our memory in our body. Just for example, this one is like, this is a lemon. So this is lemon. Even if I'm the only ones touching this one, you have, as you're watching right now, you have in your memory the lemon. You have the lemon in your head, okay? But it is not only about that. Just for example, if I taste this one, so what happened? Your initial reaction is that you're going to have a taste of that lemon in the tip of your tongue. It's like you're going to salivate. So why are you going to salivate? Precisely because your body is side by side with the synchronization of the brain and your body. It brings out. This one has stimulated your memory of the citron. That's why you salivated. So your memory is, again, the memory is not only here, it is in your entire body. And the most basic about using the brain, sensory, and memory in the classroom is that as a teacher, we teach with the brain, sensory, and memory of the children. So what does it mean? The teachers have to be aware on how the dynamics of the brain, sensory, and memory would work for each of the child inside the classroom. But the problem is this, because very often teachers are so focused on the content of the curriculum, disregarding the fact that we have the brain and sensory and memory that is responding to the content of the lesson. For example, inside the classroom, we are using different labels to describe the behaviors or the learning output of children in the classroom. For example, we have the slow learner and the fast learner, or the hyperactive learner and the very shy, non-engaging children. So what are the reasons for this? So the biological perspective of learning is telling us there are different dynamics of the brain and sensory and memory working on each child. Just for example, we have is very slow in math, cannot understand the math, cannot understand the language. The reason for that is perhaps the way we teach is not responding to the dynamics of the brain and sensory and memory of this child. And why is this child so fast? It's so easy for her to understand? Because the structure of the curriculum matches with the structure of the brain and sensory and memory of this child. So the problem is that we only have one formula, it's just the curriculum, responding for this child. And if we don't understand this child, do you think we are becoming unfair for this child who has a different dynamics in terms of the brain's sensory and memory? Think about that. The brain, sensory, and memory work in three different interconnected, interrelated ways. the stimulation, processing, and programming. The brain, sensory, and memory, we stimulate them. The brain, sensory, and memory processes, and the brain and sensory and memory programs. What do you mean by stimulation? So we activate the brain and sensory and memory. That's why in teaching and learning processes, we have to activate the brain and sensory and memory. So how do we teach in such a way that the brain and sensory and memory will be activated? So we have to think of a very engaging way to stimulate the brain, sensory, and memory. So think about this. I mean, how will you teach? And when you teach, how can you activate the brain, sensory, and memory? So this is the problem when we're just so focused on the content of the curriculum, unmindful of how this brain, sensory, and memory works for the child. Because, for example, there are times when we are so prepared with the class, we have prepared all the activity, but there are some children who are not responding to the activity that you have prepared. And sometimes we get frustrated. Why some children are not responding to the activity that I have prepared? It is because you are not able to activate the brain, the sensory, and memory. Why? We just don't know. We just don't know how the brain, sensory, and memory works for each of them. So you have to discover what is the best way that can stimulate the brain and sensory and memory of the children. And just for example, this is the object of the brain and sensory and memory. The children will be able to respond to this stimulus if this is very much connected to what is stored in their brain and sensory memory. If this ball is activating, makes them engaging, and that is stored in their memory, then definitely they will engage into that. But if this ball, in terms of the memory of children, is really boring for them, no matter what you do, this ball will not stimulate the children. Again, going back to what I've said, know exactly what will stimulate their brain, sensory, and memory of the children. Normally, teachers, we bring information into the mind, into the head, into the brain, sensory, and memory of the children. We keep on feeding and feeding and feeding. But again, remember that for each child, the dynamics is entirely different. The way they process information is entirely different. Just for example, you're teaching math. For some children, it's so easy for them to remember the symbolic mathematics. But for some children, no matter what you do, it's just so difficult for them. Perhaps symbolic math does not fit on how they look at things. Perhaps a more experiential one, a more practical one, will help them understand. What will create a problem if it's that, for example, the teacher will only focus on the symbolic mathematics without looking into the other way of presenting information to children. But again, because in going back to stimulation, and now we're going to process, there's so many ways by which children process information. And another thing is that when you're talking about the processing of information, children cannot just chew all the informations. I mean, all together. For example, how many subjects do they have? 5 or 6 subjects. Imagine for a whole day. Just can't imagine how you bombard the mind with lots of information, and you expect all these subjects will all be together, be remembered by children. Of course not. Of course, there are some children who are gifted. They can remember things. But you also have to remember, by nature, some children just cannot handle it. And we are creating so much, suffering, anxiety on the brain, sensory, and memory of the children. They can only but manage chunks of information. So you have to think about that. Because instead of really helping and shaping the nature and nurturing the brain and sensory of the children, you might be contributing so much problem and how it should work. And the third one is the program. This is the programming. Whether we like it or not, we teachers, we program the mind of children. That's why we really want to program children. We have to make it very conscious. But many teachers are unaware about that. So anything that we do inside the classroom is actually a programming of the mind. So we might as well make it a very conscious effort to really program the mind, that a programming that really nurtures the mind and life of children. So in any kind of teaching, we always expect an output. That's why when you talk about the program, we expect that something will become permanent in the life of children. For example, math, 1 plus 1. We want the children to remember that 1 plus 1 is equal to 2. So that is a program. That we want the children to understand about a certain value. Then we insist, we keep on repeating to children that this is the kind of value that they have to remember. That becomes now the program in the mind, in the brain, sensory, and memory of the children. So going back to this one, it's like we have again to remember there are different dynamics in terms of the programming. A certain program in the curriculum might not really fit on the dynamics of the brain and sensory and memory of the child. So we keep on pushing a standard curriculum, not mindful of the diversity of the mind, the brain, sensory, memory of children. So again, we might be creating a bigger problem here, because some mind of the child might be so, let's say, gifted that just very simple thing they can remember, they can easily program in their head. But there are some children, okay, that this is the only thing that they can manage. Okay, this is the only thing that they can remember. This is the only thing that they can process. The part of the nature of the brain and sensory and memory is the capacity, potential, and limitation. The brain and sensory and memory has its own capacity, potential, and limitation. For this child has his own capacity, potential, and limitation. His brain, sensory, and memory has his own capacity, potential, and limitation. And for this child also, her brain has its own capacity, potential, and limitation. So, for example, this child, this child is, by nature, this child, in terms of memorizing, she has a very sharp memory. And this child does not have a very sharp memory. Her memory is more of when he sees something, when he experiences something, that is the strength of his memory. And this child, his memory is good in everything. Now, if you're going to give a lesson or you're going to give an assessment or a quiz or exam, so for example, a memorized exam, you are giving so much favor to this child, and we are becoming so unfair to this child because his memory is more of practical thing of seeing things, right? So what we are trying to emphasize here is when we are dealing with children in terms of their brain, sensory, and memory, they have their own capacity, they have their specific strengths. and they have their potential. They have a strength that you still have to discover, and they have their own limitation. And this is the thing. When we are so focused on the curriculum and the output of the curriculum, and we forget that each of the child has his or her own limitation, then again we are creating a problem on the development of these children, because we forget that this children has his own limitation. This, for example, the limitation of the child is he cannot just memorize. No matter what he does, he cannot just memorize. But he's very good in remembering things when he does things. But again, this child, when you give an exam, it always gets perfect in the exam. Why? Because her brain is so structured, and so structured, is so in line with the curriculum that we have. So we are becoming so unfair with this child. So when we're talking about the brain, sensory, and memory, we always have to look into the capacity, the potential, and the limitation of the brain and sensory and memory for each of these children. So as teachers, what can we do to nurture the brain, sensory, and memory of the children in our classroom? Okay, first, body exercise are very helpful. So most probably before starting the class, we can do some stretching of the body, or some activity that will activate the whole brain, sensory, and memory of the children, okay, to prepare them for the lesson. The food that they eat is very, very important also. So we have to promote eating healthy food, because I've been emphasizing with my student, before coming to class you have to eat, because you have to nurture every time we eat, we refresh our body, and we refresh our body, we refresh our brain. So we are creating an environment, an internal environment for the children to be physically prepared for the class. And so we have to pay attention to that, because some children might be coming to the class without having breakfast or having lunch at all. Drink enough water daily, because water, how many percent brain is basically composed of how many percent of water? 70-75%. So the brain fundamentally needs water. Water refreshes our body, water refreshes our brain. And the next one is have a quality sleep. So nowadays, for example, with children, with the advent of technology, the cell phone, the tablet, children are spending so much with the technology that they have lessen their time for sleep. So as a teacher, we have to promote the value of sleeping, sufficient sleeping, okay? Because if the children lack sleep, then that will affect their dynamics inside the classroom, their engagement in the classroom. So you have to listen to the signals of the brain, sensory, and memory. So what are those signals? You would know. It's like if you're very sensitive to the responses of the children, you would know who among these children are having difficulty catching up. And we have to, when you pan your vision towards the children when you are teaching, you would know who among the children cannot connect with you. So that's the thing. The children should be able to connect with you. Okay, so for example, when you're teaching mathematics, you will know who among the children are having difficulty, who cannot all connect with you. So the thing is, you really have to understand how can you make children connect with the lesson by understanding the dynamic of the brain, sensory, and memory. Especially for children, allow them to rest. You would know when children are already tired, child listening to you or tired already with the activity. So it's like we are a human being. We have our own limitation. Just for example, if you have 6 subjects in a day, just imagine how our brain can accommodate these loads and loads of information. You know? And we have to stop working when we are already overloaded. We should know how to say stop. Okay? Because some people keep on working and working and working all, when their body and sensory and brain already telling them to stop. I'm already tired. Okay. Never push the brain and sensory and memory beyond its limit. Again, memory, brain, sensory has its own limit. Okay. The next is breathe fresh air. Children would need some fresh air to breathe. Sometimes when the situation is becoming toxic already, the classroom is becoming toxic already. So it's important to bring the children out of the classroom to keep the brain and sensory more in a more relaxed mode. The next one is to know the basic function of the brain, sensory, and memory. So if teachers are very much aware of the function of the brain and sensory and memory in terms of teaching and learning, then teachers will be able to identify clearly on what will work for each of the child, or what will nurture, what kind of activity will nurture the brain, sensory, and memory. So beyond the curriculum, beyond the content of the lesson, how can I actually nurture the life of children? The next one is avoid negativity. Teaching sometimes can be very, very toxic, and we don't allow the children to experience how toxic things can be. That's why, as much as possible, we create a more positive avenue, positive experiences for children in terms of learning, in terms of our teaching. And the next is we have to identify situations that might not be really helping the children, because we might find ourselves in a situation that we keep on pushing on something, but the children are alienated, are disconnected to what we are doing in the classroom. So we have to find activities or dynamics that can be more effective in terms of nurturing the brain, sensory, and memory of children. Right. Okay, let us try to answer some questions here. Okay, the first question is, does genes influence the functions of the brain, sensory, and memory? Of course. That's why we have children with autism, we have children with mental retardation, children with ADHD, children with cerebral palsy, or children with Down syndrome, children with exceptional ability. So these are basically genetic, and we know for a fact that in terms of mainstream teaching, for example, children with autism would respond differently in a standard curriculum. That is why we have created a different way to respond to them. But for example, if you put in a regular classroom, if you put in children with Down syndrome, and the way we teach is just a regular thing, and we don't respond to the needs of these children, so definitely this child would not learn from you. This child would not be able to respond or connect with you. Okay, so genes has its influence in the brain, sensory, and memory, and how it works inside the classroom. But it's not only for those who have of, of different abilities, or what do you call these children with special needs. Even in a regular classroom, um, we really have to understand the dynamics of the brain, sensory, and memory for each of the children. The next question is the teaching strategy pleasurable to the brain, sensory, and memory? So you will have to answer that question yourself. And you can only have a clear answer to that if you become more sensitive to the responses of children to you. So your teaching can be very, very what do you call this? Um, can be very, very pleasurable if this is really stimulating, and children are able to process information, and at the end of the stimulation and processing, something remains, something is programmed in the mind and life of children. Then we could probably say you are successful, because you were able to maximize the three dynamics: the stimulation, processing, and programming. So again, take note when you are teaching, and in terms of the learning of children, is it stimulating? Are the children able to process information? Were you successful in programming the intended outcome of the lesson? Okay. The third question is, do you overload information? For example, now I might be overloading you with information, but we have to take time. I mean, take time in processing information as you're listening to me. Is it possible? I mean, it's really possible that we're really overloading information. Imagine, in one day you have 6 subjects that you have to process in your head. That's why at the end, for example, you have 6 subjects. At the end of the day, for example, in Bahrain, they will end the class at 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock. By the time they reach 1 o'clock, the brain is dead already, is overly worked already. Okay? That's why if your course, if your subject is assigned at 1 o'clock and that is the last subject, so you will have to find it, because children would really want to go home already. So your subject might not be stimulating at all because children would want to go home. So we have to plan it out. So even my class is at 1 o'clock, how can I make the class more exciting for children? And the next question is, they have time to process information. And this is the problem with this standard curriculum, because we are trying to follow a sequence of unit of studies, that we have to finish this one at this time, and we have to finish this one for this month. But the thing is, are we giving time for children to really process this information? Are we giving time for children to make this lesson to be more stimulating for them? Are we giving time for children to program the lessons in their mind and their life? Okay, so that is the very, very big question. And the next thing is, are there factors? Do you have a positive relationship? So creating a positive relationship can be a very, very good stimulus for children, because sometimes, no matter how good you are in your subject, because for example, you're very good in, you have mastered your mathematics or science, but the thing is, if you don't have a good relationship with children, and very often social connection is a positive stimulus for children. So if you have a good relationship with children, a very solid connection, positive connection, no matter how difficult the subject, that can become a stimulus for them to become more interested in learning, because they have the respect for you. You have your respect for the children. They have your unconditional regard, unconditional care for the children. So that becomes a stimulus that can trigger interest or pleasure in terms of learning. Next is, um, are the learning clear to them? So this is another challenge. So you have at least 25 to 30 students in front of you, and if you are really serious about teaching and learning, you really have to pay attention to each of those to each of those children and how they respond. But that makes actually very exciting, and how the brain and sensory and memory works for them. But if you are just so focused on the content of the lesson, on how to deliver it, and I don't know. But for me, teaching children becomes more exciting if I understand the brain, how the brain and sensory and memory work for them. And the thing is this, uh, are there things in the classroom that distract our attention? I mean, about the question about attentiveness, catching the attention of children. Come on, in this 21st century, with the use of technology, there are so many distractions in the head of the children. So you cannot have, I'm telling you, you can never ever have 100% attention. Even for us adults, we cannot have a 100% attention on for example, on the teacher, I mean, explaining the lesson. But let's say you have 70 to 80% way of really catching the attention. You really have to plan that out, because the brain of children now is so wired because of technology. There's so many exciting things happening with technology. But you have a very boring class, you know, you're very traditional in the way you deliver things. Definitely your class will never vary, will not stimulate the interest of children. So you have to compete with this technology. So what does it mean? So we have to level up on the way we execute teaching and learning processes in the classroom with the advent of technology and the social media. Okay, next is, are there aspects of the classroom that impact how the brain and sensory work? Of course, the family. This is one of the factor. If for example, children are coming from a divorced family, children are coming from a very traumatic experiences outside the school, whether you like it or not, the brain and sensory works for them. They remember things. And children, they don't have that capacity yet to handle situation, and many things are running in their head. So it can also impact, it can also impact their engagement in the classroom. Do the neurochemicals in the brain impact the influence the attention motivation? Yes. Like for example, when you're talking about ADHD, so ADHD are very rich in dopamine. So you have to maximize their energy in a very positive way. And you also have to be mindful of reminding children, reminding rather the parents of the food, of the dietary what they call this, planning for children, because if you're increasing so much carb on children, so that also increases dopamine. And when you have a very strong dopamine, so that creates energy for children. So yeah, but basically it impacts the chemicals in the brain, in our brain, actually impact the dynamics of children in the classroom. This is another important aspect of the brain, sensory, and memory. It is not only about you as teacher, who should be aware about how the brain and sensory works in teaching, learning. Very importantly, students should be aware on how the brain and sensory and memory work for them. The children should become aware on their capacity, potential, and limitation of the brain, sensory, and memory. Children should be able to articulate, "I'm having difficulty on this. This is my way of understanding this." When children would raise their hand and come up with a question of, "This is my way of connecting with a lesson," children would say, "I cannot understand the symbolic math. There must be a way of explaining that to me." And that is exactly the success of understanding the biological aspect of learning, when the children themselves will understand how the brain, sensory, and memory work for them. Again, it's not only about you as a teacher. It is about the children embracing and nurturing their own brain, sensory, and memory. Now, my dear teachers, the fundamental challenge now in our role and responsibility as a teacher in the classroom is, in terms of the biological perspective of learning, is to understand the dynamics of the brain, sensory, and memory. Is to understand the capacity, potential, and limitation of the brain, sensory, and memory. And in terms of teaching and learning in the classroom, the challenge is also about understanding the dynamics of the brain, sensory, and memory of each child. So when you say you have 30 students, understanding 30 children is a bit challenging. But if you really want to look into how wonderful the brain and sensory works in the terms of teaching and learning process, that becomes, teaching becomes and learning becomes more exciting. And lastly is that we have to find a way that, in terms of teaching and learning, things that will be more stimulating, that will be helpful in terms of processing information, and dynamics that will be more helpful in programming the life and mind of children. And that goes to the aspect of the teaching and learning is actually building the life of children. So beyond the curriculum that we have, it's like we're making use of the curriculum to build up what is basic in our life as a human being, which is the brain, sensory, and memory. I would like to give 3 questions that I want us to reflect. The first is that what can I do as a teacher to promote the awareness of the dynamics of the brain, sensory, and memory in the classroom, not only for me as a teacher, but also for the students. The second thing is that what are the activities, what dynamics can I create in the classroom that will nurture the brain, sensory, and memory of the children? And last is, I would like you to reflect on our case study. Remember Zainab? What do you think is the reason? Using the biological perspective of learning, what do you think is the reason why all of a sudden Zainab changed her behavior in the classroom? Thank you. What? What are you trying to say?